Hello and welcome to another of the eBiology Teacher Podcasts. I'm Mr. Doc, and today we're talking about cells. Particularly, we're talking about the introduction part of cells so that we understand what they are, because we have to understand what they are before we can understand what they do. So that's where we're at. We're going to start with a basic overview of cells. And we're going to do sort of the, kind of how we discovered them and who's responsible, a little bit of history, and then that'll prepare us for another lesson on the individual parts of cells and what they actually do. So today we're going to talk about the cell theory, which is probably one of, if not the most important scientific concept when it comes to biology, because it really guides everything that we understand about how things are alive. We're going to identify a couple of the basic parts that are in all cells. We're going to talk about two types of cells, the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes, and we're going to distinguish similarities and differences between them. And finally, we're going to review hierarchy, which we covered in a previous unit. As a quick review, we all already know that a cell is the smallest unit that can carry on all the processes of life. And as we've defined earlier, the 7 characteristics of life are that we have cellular organization, the ability to reproduce, can grow and develop, change over time, respond to stimuli, have homeostasis, and metabolism. So a cell has all of those things. Even in a multicellular organism, all the individual cells in that organism have those things. Now, I want you to remember that that doesn't mean movement was nowhere on that list, because that's not a requirement. The ability to think or to have a brain, that's not in that list. Okay, so things that are alive if they meet those 7 criteria. Okay, so those are our criteria for what a cell is and if a cell is alive or not. And many years ago, 2 scientists' ideas combined together to form what we know as the modern cell theory. The fathers of the cell theory are Robert Hooke and a guy named Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Now, I'm pretty sure Leeuwenhoek on your screen is somewhat misspelled, because there's supposed to be an umlaut over, I believe, the O, but I didn't know how to type an umlaut because I don't speak German and I don't have a German keyboard, so I'm sorry. All right, there are 3 parts of the cell theory, and they're very important. First of all living things are composed of 1 or more cells. That's probably the simplest idea. Everything's made up of 1 or more cells. There you go. There is a little hidden truth in there, and that is, can you have an organism that is just 1 cell? Well, if the rule is everything is made up of 1 or more cells, then yes, you can have organisms that are only 1 cell or unicellular organisms. The second part is that cells are the basic unit of structure and function for all living things. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function for all living things. That means that not only do cells make up every living thing, but what the cells do allows the organism to do what it does. Okay, so let's take a look at this in a more specific way. Imagine your digestive tract. There's a lot of things going on, from your mouth down your esophagus into your stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and all that other stuff. That is made up of tissue that's made up of cells. So that's what gives it its structure. But it's made up of particular types of cells, and those cells are able to do a particular job. It is because those cells can do that job that your digestive tract works how your digestive tract is supposed to work. Okay? If your digestive tract was made up the same cells as your skin, your digestive tract wouldn't work, because the cells provide the structure, but they also provide the function, and your skin cells don't do digestion. That's not what they're built for. They're built to cover and protect. Your digestive system has cells in it that they're responsible for producing acids and enzymes that allow us to digest food. So when we talk about cells, they're not only the basic unit of structure, meaning we're made up of cells, but it's what those cells do that allow us to do what we do. All right. So when we talk about something in a human that stops working, we have some sort of medical dysfunction, it's probably because, strike that, it is because the cells involved in that process aren't working correctly. All right. So everything that we do is really down at the cellular level, and we have to think that way. We as an organism have bigger issues, but ultimately it's because the cells are in dysfunction, not because of the organism as a whole. The last thing, and what in my opinion will keep the cell theory as a cell theory, is that all cells come from the reproduction of existing cells. This is pretty much a no-brainer, except for one small thing. We understand that if you're going to make more cells, cells have to reproduce. That's simple. We get that. However, ultimately, somebody's going to ask the question, if all cells come from existing cells, where did the first cell come from? Well, science has its explanation, religion has its explanation, crazy conspiracy theorists on the internet have their own explanation, like that the human race was put here by an advanced species of alien. It's actually a real theory called directed panspermia. Look it up, or don't waste your time. Anyway, that's why the cell theory is going to be a theory, because we really can't definitively answer that question, where did the first cell come from? And by the way, the whole we were put here by aliens, that's the explanation. Well, where did the aliens come from? Where did their first cell come from? Okay, see my point? All right, anyway, moving on. A little bit of history about the guys who came up with the cell theory. And by the way, I am going to go back one more time just to review. Cells are made up of all living things are made up of one or more cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function, all living things, and cells come from the reproduction of existing cells. That's the cell theory. You need to know those parts. Robert Hooke used a very, very rudimentary early light microscope, and what he noticed when looking at plant cells, particularly dead plant cells in cork, was that all these cells were made up of these little boxes that reminded him of the cells in which monks lived. Little repeated boxes. And as he looked in the stems and the roots and looked at ferns and looked at all these plants, he noticed that those boxes were everywhere, and he coined the term cells. Now, Leeuwenhoek was the first person to actually see cells in their living form. He also made the connection that not only were plants made up of these little boxes, but animals were made up of these little boxes, even though the little boxes carried a different shape. Gee, I wonder why they had a different shape. Could it be because they had a different function? Shape, function, together? Hello? All right. So what we're talking about here is that cells, right, work together. And these guys were looking at these, and they were going, wow, plants are made of these little boxes, animals are made of these little boxes. And by the way, Anton van Leeuwenhoek was the first person to ever see a single-celled organism. Imagine how surprised he was when he looked at a sample of pond water from the pond outside his wherever he lived, and he saw these little single boxes or these little cells swimming around. He was like, oh my goodness. All of a sudden, what we know about life is completely different. We thought there were plants and there were animals. And we even thought that fungi were plants. But now all of a sudden, we see that the cells in fungi are different than the cells in plants. And we see that the cells in animals are different than the cells in fungi and plants. So everything was kind of a shift. It really changed the way we looked at life. And we also learned that there are living things that are only one cell big, which is really kind of cool. All right. Now there are some basic things that we need to understand. First of all, cell shape will determine cell function. This is something we've hit over and over again. If you're going to have a covering over an organism, those cells need to be thin and flat. Well, if you look at the skin cells on the screen, those are very thin and flat. If you need cells to, say, communicate from one part to another of the cell of the organism, you need to have the little branches like this nerve cell and so forth. Plant cells, on the other hand, don't have a bone structure or anything, any kind of skeletal structure, so they need to be nicely tight packed together so that they can hold their own shape. That's why they are shaped the way they are. We also need to understand that size does play a role in function. A cell is limited by the relationship of its outer surface to its volume. That means that cells are limited by the amount of stuff that we can put in them. Now, there is something that's very simple to understand here. When we measure volume, we measure it cubed. Okay, so if I take length times width times height, that gives me centimeters cubed. If I'm measuring, students are trying to get in my room, and they shouldn't be, because I'm talking to you. If I'm measuring surface area, it's length times width. That's squared. So if I increase volume, that's a factor of a cube. That's length times width times height. If I'm increasing surface area, I'm length times width, and that's going to increase by a squared factor. So if I increase volume, it's going to increase faster than if I increase surface area. So ultimately, what am I talking about? Imagine blowing up a balloon. When you add air to the balloon, the volume is increasing by a factor of a cube, 3 times. But the surface area can only extend by a factor of a square because it's surface area. That means that ultimately, if I put too much stuff in the balloon, it's going to pop. Same is true of cells. Cells can only contain so much stuff before ultimately they'll just pop. Okay. Now, a couple of things that we do need to know. There are 3 things that are in every cell, no matter what kind of cell it is. Yes, there is a diversity of cells on this planet, the likes of which are unimaginable. However, if we look at cells and we look at all the different kinds of cells, there are certain things they have in common. This sounds like unity and diversity to me, which we talked about earlier, right? Even though there's a whole bunch of different stuff, it's very, very similar. Okay. Now, all cells have a plasma membrane or a cell membrane. This is what defines the outer part of the cell from the inner part of the cell. And of course, if cells all have an outer boundary, that means they have insidey parts. That's what we call the cytoplasm, all the area inside the cell, and that includes the liquid medium, which is often called cytoplasm. And finally, all cells have a command and control center, which is called the nucleus. Now, the nuclei are considerably different from cell type to cell type because we do have 2 types of cells. Prokaryotes, which include all bacteria, have a nuclear region, but that nucleus doesn't have its own membrane. It means that all the DNA is basically just hanging out in one spot. Whereas eukaryotes, these are membrane-bound nuclei cells, meaning their cells have a nucleus around their membrane as well as other organelles, which are little structures in there, that do things, do different jobs for the cell, which we'll talk about in another podcast. All other kingdoms, other than bacteria, are eukaryotic. So animals, plants, fungi, protists, they're all eukaryotes. Now, let me clear something up because a lot of people get this a little confused. All cells have an outer membrane. Prokaryotes have a nuclear region, but there's not a membrane around the nucleus. Okay? Eukaryotes have a membrane around the nucleus, and there are little structures in the cell that have their own membranes inside the cell. So every cell has that outer membrane, but prokaryotes don't have the membrane around the nucleus, whereas eukaryotes do. It wasn't until a couple of weeks ago that I really got a good analogy for you. My cable, internet, and phone went down, so I had to call the cable company, and they came out, and 2 guys in 2 different trucks. One truck, the guy opened up, and everything was nice and neat. He had a thing of tools here, and he had little drawers with all his little components, and all the wires were nicely wound, and there were boxes and shelves and whatever. And then the other truck, the guy opened it up, and all of his tools were there, but they were everywhere. And there were little baggies of things all over the place, and you couldn't find anything. A eukaryote's kind of like the first truck. Everything is kind of organized, and it's got its own membrane, and it's organized and everything nice and neat. The prokaryote, it can still do all the same jobs. It's still kind of got all the same stuff. It's just not quite as organized. It doesn't have those membranes where everything is organized and does everything together. Okay, so that's the analogy I use. I think it works, but if I confused you, sorry. We'll try to figure something else out. All right. So, the last thing we're going to talk about is the hierarchy of cellular organization. Remember that as cells evolve, they become specialized and they're able to work independently or in some cases together. If cells work together, that means we have a hierarchy. And we've covered this before. Matter starts with atoms, and then atoms form molecules. Molecules actually form macromolecules, which form organelles. Now, the word organelle actually means little organ. Little organ. So organelles are kind of like the organs of a cell, but remember that organelles aren't alive because cells are where life starts. Cells that work together to form a particular function is a tissue. Tissues that form a similar structure is called an organ. Organs that work together are called an organ system. And finally, you have an organism. So what about our objectives? Well, first of all, the cell theory is 3 components established by Robert Hooke and Anton van Leeuwenhoek. The first one is that all living things are made up of one or more cells. Number two, cells are the basic unit of structure and function, which means they not only make up what we are, but allow us to do what we do. And finally, cells come from pre-existing cells. Cells come from reproduction of existing cells. Remember that all cells have a plasma membrane, all cells have cytoplasm, and all cells have some sort of DNA-based nucleus. However, prokaryotes, and by the way, pro means early, karya means cells, so early cells, prokaryotes don't have a membrane-bound nucleus, whereas eukaryotes, which eu means true, so that's true cells, actually have a membrane-bound nucleus. And by the way, I'm telling you what those words mean, but prokaryotes and eukaryotes are all really cells, but prokaryotes means early cells and eukaryotes means true cells, and then see if that helps. Remember that all cells provide not only the structure but also the function, which means if we have a whole bunch of different types of cells, in other words shapes, we have a whole bunch of different types of functions. So if we have cells that have a different shape, that means they give us a different function, and that becomes very important. And finally, the hierarchy of cellular organization starts with atoms, which is where matter starts. Atoms bond together to form molecules, molecules bond together to form macromolecules, macromolecules bond together in different ways to form organelles, which are small organ-like structures inside a cell. Then we get cells. Cells work together to form tissue. Tissue forms organs. Organs form organ systems, and organ systems are organisms. And keep in mind, by the way, that if a cell is a single organism, let's say like an amoeba, it's not going to have an organ system because it's one cell, right? And that's okay. Not all living things have organ systems. And that's a good little lesson to end on. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that it has helped. Come back and there'll be a podcast on organelles because we're going to go over each one of them and what they do. And I will see you then. Bye, y'all.